Hi folks, thanks for joining us. We are in the Smithsonian American Art Museum right now for our Facebook Live. We're just going to take a moment before we get started to let folks join in. Thanks for joining us. We're going to get started in just a minute.
Hi, welcome. Thank you. First timer here. My name's Ann Evan Haugen. We're so happy you joined us. I'm the head librarian for the Smithsonian's American Art and Portrait Gallery Library, one of 21 libraries here at the Smithsonian. And today we're in the print study room of the Smithsonian American Art Museum, getting a behind the scenes peek at some of the works in the collection with senior curator Eleanor Harvey. For the last 2 weeks, and I hope you've been tuning in, we've been focusing on the works of William Henry Holmes as part of the hashtag Many Hats of Holmes social media event with the Smithsonian Transcription Center. Holmes he wore a lot of hats, but he was an archaeologist, an anthropologist, and today, most importantly, an artist. To wrap up our recent Holmesapalooza, we're going to look at some examples of his own art. For this Facebook Live event, if you have any questions during the broadcast, feel free to leave a comment. Erin Rushing is our outreach librarian, and she's manning the camera and will pose them to us as they come in. We'll also try to respond to comments after the broadcast. And if you'd like to take a look at any of the works we have out today, because none of these are actually on view right now, many are available online, and we will also post the links in the comments. So let's get started. William Henry Holmes' specialties were drawings and watercolors, and the American Art Museum has more than 60 of them in their collection. And Eleanor's specialty is 19th century art, in particular landscape painting and Southwestern American art. So right up Holmes' alley. Thanks so much for being our tour guide today, Eleanor. Sure. Can you walk us through some of these artworks?
Certainly. First of all, hello. It's nice to have all of you here today. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Holmes's background, just to couch the works of art that you're going to see here. Holmes was born in Ohio in 1846 and studied both art and geology while he was in high school and in college, bringing together the arts and the sciences in a way that will typify his career and really epitomize that of the Smithsonian as well. In 1871, he came to Washington, D.C., and he was going to study art with Theodore Kaufman, another DC-based artist, but he ended up drawing shells and fossils for scientists at the Smithsonian's Natural History Museum. And it was there in 1872 that Ferdinand Hayden discovered him. Hayden had just come back from Yellowstone with Thomas Moran in 1871, the epic trip that would culminate in both Yellowstone being set aside as America's first national park and Moran's gigantic painting of the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone, which is on view in our second floor galleries, to be purchased by Congress for the nation. So Holmes replaces Moran for the 1872 return trip to Yellowstone. And in fact, if you go there or look on a map, you will find that there is a Mount Holmes in Yellowstone that is actually named for William Henry Holmes and for his contributions to that survey. When they got back to D.C., Holmes decided to switch careers slightly and ended up working in scientific illustration, but maintaining his interests in archaeology, which wasn't really accepted as a science at that point. And so in 1879, he will go to Europe in order to put the finishing touches on his artistic career. This is a good moment for us to now start focusing on the works of art themselves. And the first one I want to bring to your attention is a lovely little watercolor. This is William Henry Holmes painting his friend and colleague Max Weil, who was also a DC-based artist. They were both members of the Washington Watercolor Club, and they were both members of what became known as the Washington Landscape School. This is about 1875, and what you find here is that Weil is seated in his camp stool underneath a white artist's umbrella to filter the light. His sketch box is propped on his knees. That's where the inscription is. You'll see a piece of paper sticking up from it to guide you to know where the artist is sketching, and he's holding another portfolio of papers and probably a small palette in his left hand. This is a typical sketching apparatus. This is the kind of thing that artists have been taking out into the field really for the better part of the century, from the Hudson River School forward. And in fact, there's a lovely watercolor by Winslow Homer of 3 artists sketching in the White Mountains, each underneath his own white umbrella, so that it looks like a wonderful sort of episode of artists out in the woods. But it captures both the way that Holmes is able to selectively focus and let go out of focus different parts of the art. But this is the type of sketching outfit that Holmes also would have taken with him on all of his sketching trips. So where did he go? In 1874, the year before he accomplishes that watercolor, Holmes is out in Colorado, and he's there with William Henry Jackson, the photographer, and Ferdinand Hayden. And what you see here is a field watercolor of a folded strata, a great geological arch in Colorado. Now, what's interesting about this is most artists, when they're working in the field, don't do highly detailed things. They do color sketches that will help them remember things when they go back into the studio. So what you'll notice about this watercolor is it's the folded strata itself that is the only thing that is in sharp focus in this watercolor. The sky, the clouds, the surrounding landscape, the trees, and the path in the foreground are all vaguely suggested as though they are kind of dissolving in color. But that strata is so carefully distinguished that Holmes would be able to take that back to the studio and think about incorporating it into a painting using this as a memory guide. So this is the kind of watercolor that you expect to find out in the field, done in that kind of setup that you just saw in the watercolor of Max Weil. So when Holmes is not out west with Hayden, he then goes to the Grand Canyon with John Wesley Powell, who is also really important when it comes to understanding the Grand Canyon.
And if I can interrupt you for a second, I just wanted to mention for folks who are now joining us, we're taking a look at the art of William Henry Holmes in the prints and drawings collection at the Smithsonian American Art Museum as a part of a 2-week-long event celebrating his life and his work. If you'd like to take a closer look at the art for yourself, many are available online, and we will post links in the comments. Sorry, Eleanor.
No problem, no problem. The next work, which is the one that we opened with here, is a much more finished watercolor, and you can look at it and it takes no time at all to recognize that this watercolor from 1875 is completely different in technique from the one we just looked at. Everything is very carefully articulated. Everything has a kind of documentary quality to it. The explorer who is there in the foreground is pretty much there for scale, and what you're looking at are the Anasazi Ruins from the American Southwest. In 1875, Holmes went with the U.S. Geological Survey down to the American Southwest. He was completely captivated by Anasazi Indian culture. And so this is the kind of watercolor that probably was not done in the field. It's larger, it's much more detailed, it's much more documentary in its approach, and it's precisely the kind of work that Holmes would have made after his return, extrapolated from field sketches like the one you saw before. The other thing that gives us a clue that this is a more official watercolor rather than a snapshot or a personal recollection is this is a scan of the back of the board that this watercolor is painted on. And if you can read it, it says Department of the Interior, U.S. Geological Survey of the Territories. Holmes was working for the U.S. Geological Survey, so they provided the board that he was using for the watercolors that would end up being either published as chromolithographs or turned into parts of exhibitions. And in fact, what's really interesting about the level of detail in this watercolor is the following year, in 1876, Holmes will create the replica of the Anasazi Ruins that are on view as part of the dioramas at the 1876 centennial in Philadelphia. So this is a man who is literally an artist, an archaeologist, a geologist, and an exhibition designer. He's already beginning to wear more hats than we would otherwise know about. So from there, he's going to continue to be a restless traveler. As I mentioned, in 1879, he will go to Munich to study with Frank Duveneck, one of the leading artists of that generation. And in fact, his friend Max Weil has already arrived there the year before in 1878. The two of them will spend time there. And it'll loosen up his style a little bit. And what you see in this lovely, very informal watercolor, this is on the steamer Bremen off Nova Scotia in 1880. And you can see that amidst the chop of the North Atlantic waves, there is also a ship on the horizon with its smokestack. You can see the prevailing wind, strong as it is in the background there. This is 1880. This is a moment when artists like Winslow Homer are starting to loosen up everyone's style and focus on the power of the ocean. But this is probably also done literally on the ship's deck on his return trip from Europe. They would have taken the North Atlantic route, the same route basically that the Titanic will take later on, coming across from Europe to North America. But as you can see, it's lively and it's lovely. It probably didn't take him very long to do this sketch. Each of the strokes has a kind of purity to it. The sky has this lovely sort of wet-on-wet quality to it. And this is the kind of watercolor that Holmes would have used as really, again, a recollection of his visit. Now, one of the works you're not seeing today is a much larger watercolor that looks at just the ocean. It's exactly the same palette. It's about 4 times the size. And it's pretty clear that it was an after-the-fact watercolor done based on sketches like this that Holmes actually did on the deck of the steamer. We can sort of extrapolate from this that Holmes didn't get seasick. It's a very steady work. His colleague, if you will, Frederick Church, got violently seasick when he was in the North Atlantic, and his companion wrote about how difficult it was for Church to be able to paint anything out on open water. Holmes doesn't seem to be having that kind of problem at all.
He wore so many hats, a sailor's hat as well.
Exactly. So when he comes back, Holmes will end up going to Mexico in 1882 with William Henry Jackson, and we have photographs that Jackson took in Palenque and Chichen Itza that are from those trips down there. And in fact, in 1889, Holmes will find American Indian petroglyphs in West Virginia. I don't exactly know where they are, but the man never stopped thinking in terms of science as he was also thinking about art. He will work for the U.S. Geological Survey until 1889, when he then takes over the job of the Bureau of American Ethnology within the Smithsonian. John Wesley Powell had been running it up until then. And then during the middle of the 1890s, he will take a couple of years and go work at the Field Museum in Chicago. But he'll come back to the Smithsonian and to the U.S. Geological Survey, and he'll run the head of the Anthropology Division, which is at that point a brand new science for the Americas. So in 1900, Holmes takes a vacation, and he goes to Jamaica. And I love this small watercolor, partly because it has the kind of intimacy of a snapshot. It's beautifully composed. You can tell it's a professional artist who has really thought hard about how to organize the scenery, and the two people on the path that you see in the foreground, and then another group of people at the very back with this pathway that's going to lead you all the way back to the bay and to the mountains beyond. But as you can also see from my hand, this is not a large work of art at all. And in fact, Holmes made a number of very small paintings, again, probably the moral equivalent of Polaroid snapshots, where you just simply take pictures of things that interest you while you're on your way. Holmes seemed always to carry a set of watercolors with him everywhere he went. And whether he's doing informal things like this view of Jamaica, or whether he's doing something much more official and formal, as in his Anasazi Ruins, He is always working, always thinking, and always looking. The other thing you'll notice is he's always signing things, and he's always dating things, and he writes himself little notes. And so we know a lot about most of Holmes's works of art because he was helpful enough, where he didn't write directly on the work of art, to actually give us a small piece of paper that reminds us where things were made. And I'm going to take the liberty of lifting up this mat in order to show you that in this case, it's a picture that was purchased from the artist by James Murdoch and then given to the Smithsonian, so that even his friends felt the need to document things on his behalf. If we look backward at the steamship Bremen, there you can see one of Holmes's carefully typed labels that give us a sense of what it is that we have here. You'll notice it says presented to the Library of the National Gallery, July 1930, and that brings us to one of the later pieces of Holmes's career, because that National Gallery to which he refers is none other than today's Smithsonian American Art Museum. We don't have the time to go into all of the politics behind how the National Gallery of Art became the Smithsonian American Art Museum and the National Gallery of Art is now someplace else. Suffice to say that the first National Gallery of Art was, in fact, the art arm of the Smithsonian Institution. And as it will turn out, in 1920, William Henry Holmes will lobby to become its first director. So we will go from a man who will run the Bureau of Ethnology to the Archaeology Department to becoming the director of the first art museum within the Smithsonian. This is a man who never thought that the arts and the sciences should be at all separated, something that I think infuses the way the Smithsonian thinks about its own collections and its own museums. Holmes didn't do things just because he needed to for his jobs or when he was on vacation. He also saw beautiful scenes in the local scenery, and we're very pleased to be showing you one of his watercolors of Haines Point. Don't be surprised if you don't recognize Haines Point. This is Haines Point in what you would think of as an early pristine setting. It's 1908. But one of the things that Anne discovered as she was doing a little bit of research on this is that Haines Point was an artificial island that was dredged out of the Potomac. And so this is Holmes looking at a landscape that is just as sculpted as, say, the National Mall, and just as picturesque. And what you have here, of course, are the ducks down on next to the lily pads. You've got birds taking off in the middle and up into the sky. And it's just one of those refreshing, beautiful days that makes you think that he's been looking at the work of Camille Corot in Paris with those sort of sage greens and frosty blues. But again, it's a very loosely rendered watercolor, very clearly something that's of personal interest to him. But again, it combines that selective focus on trees and then allowing everything else in the watercolor to simply become a kind of lovely blur. And so it's a highly atmospheric piece, and it's something that really is a signature of Holmes's style and Holmes's career. I mentioned in 1920 that Holmes became the director of the National Gallery of Art, but he never let go of his interest in archaeology. And one of the first exhibitions that he organized for that new museum was an exhibition of Pacific Northwest Coast Indian art, making it clear that art for him spanned both the fine arts as well as artistic traditions of different cultures from around the world. The final work of art I want you to see, though, is a capstone in a way, but also a recognition that for Holmes, the end of his career was as much an exercise in memory as it was anything else. This is a beautiful, large-scale watercolor from 1924 called A Cliff Dweller's Ceremony in Colorado. It's a memory piece. It's set in a kind of landscape that doesn't seem to be of this earth, and yet it seems to be both timeless as well as something that is concrete and eerily remembered. What Holmes has given you is what looks like a precipice over a large cave with a huge gathering of people for this ceremony. The cliff dwellings, of course, are the ones at Mesa Verde and for the Anasazi. there's a sense, in a way, of almost a city down below, as well as then a shot to this distant cliff with this beautiful sort of Art Deco type arch going on. The fact that it's so highly expressionistic, that there are these large strokes of color back and forth, these drips of paint, that there's no longer the need to be fussy and precise and ethnographically accurate. This is really a piece that in a way sums up Holmes's life and career. The magic of earlier civilizations, the cultural traditions that gave you those ceremonies, the memory of those ceremonies that Holmes must have felt in the echoes as he walked through the ruins of the American Southwest, but then also the sense of perpetuity, a sense of timelessness, that as you walk through those ruins, you feel the centuries slough off as though you were actually witnessing those events of bygone years and centuries. Holmes had a really interesting perspective on art and science. I think he truly believed through the science of archaeology we could not only get to know past civilizations, disappeared civilizations better, but that through art we could bring them back to life. And it's a nice way of thinking about the way that Holmes structured both his career at the Smithsonian and his career as an artist by looking at this particular group of artworks.
Thank you so much, Eleanor. This is fantastic. And this one is a great one to end on because he was in his 70s when he painted this. And when he retired from the Smithsonian, he was in his 80s.
86 years old.
Yeah, he had spent more than 50 years working for the Smithsonian. So he's a pretty amazing person, clearly, and an interesting history. I think we do have a few minutes for if there are any comments or questions that popped up, and Erin can let us know.
We've had two questions pop up. One is about the art itself. Did he use any gouache on top of his watercolor?
Yes, he did. Actually, you can see the gouache early on in... There's a little bit in this watercolor of the arches in the whites. It's that chalky white pigment, so that when you can see it lying on top of the blue there where it looks like white oil paint. That's actually gouache there. He will use it to reinforce both his explorer, and you can look along that cliff in order to catch the highlights on the desiccated rock. He will use it again on the wave caps in the steamer Bremen. There's no gouache in the Jamaican picture, but that's not really all that surprising.
It was vacation.
Yeah, he's using it just intermittently, just on the lily pads here. He has scraped out the surface of the paper underneath the mallard ducks, which is something that Homer will also do. In order to get you those reflection lines, he'll actually scratch back into the surface and remove the paint rather than adding a layer of white, which is what he's doing on the blossoms there. And it's arguable. I don't think there's really any, there may be a little bit of gouache in order to intensify some of the dark colors. Gouache is basically what happens when you take watercolor and make it opaque. Watercolors, by definition, are transparent or translucent when they go down on a piece of paper. If you need more body, you will end up adding something, either a calcium carbonate or white, to give it some substance, or you'll end up adding a carbon-based pigment on the surface in order to get the darks in there. But that allows you to get an opaque layer rather than the kind of transparency that watercolor is best known for.
Another one of our questions was, is there any chance of doing an all Holmes exhibit?
You know, it could certainly happen in the fullness of time. It's really, I think, a matter of wanting to do more than just put up the watercolors and say we're done. I think if we were going to do something like that, the nice thing to do would be to tie it to the history of the Smithsonian and really look at not just Holmes's career as a kind of roadmap through those first decades of the Smithsonian, but also to really understand that at that point your museum director is also, when he's at archaeology, he's an active archaeologist. When he's in the Bureau of Ethnology, he's an active producing person, and when he moves over to the art museum, the artistic piece of it comes right along with him. So you'd want to do more than just tell a biographical story, but really sort of tie it to the way that this institution sort of fosters creativity.
And I will jump in on that and say that we will be having a display of William Henry Holmes' random records of a lifetime. They're the scrapbooks that Holmes kept. They were bound and finished at the end of his life in 1932 and donated to the Smithsonian's National Gallery of Art Library. And since we do have many of them digitized and transcribed as part of this event.
Thank you, volunteers.
Yes, we'll be putting a few of the original works on display in the library in the spring of 2017. So.
And I will say there is a William Henry Holmes painting that is hanging in Secretary Scorton's parlor over in the castle. So if you are fortunate enough to be in a meeting in the Secretary's parlor, look up on the walls. I'm sure you can find it.
Yes. Should we all be so fortunate? Are there any other questions you think?
We had one quick question. Are any of his works rare?
Well,
I'd say most.
I would say
They're
yes.
all unique.
Here's the thing. We have what I believe to be the lion's share of the works of art that he made. Partly because so many of them were done during years when he was associated with the Smithsonian, and he and his family had such warm feelings about it that as he was thinking about the disposition of his estate, and this is a man who was very thorough and very organized. You can call them random records, but we're talking
They're so
about
not random.
so not random. 16 volumes of chronologically organized correspondence, sketches, field notes, etc. It really just makes us all feel like disorganized messes. We do have those. We have the photographic albums that he worked with in order to help William Henry Jackson figure out what he was going to do when he got ready to publish his own photographs as albums. We have a large number of the works of art, and I would imagine the Bureau of Ethnology and Natural History also have associated materials. So yes, you will find occasionally a William Henry Holmes painting because he did exhibit at the Corcoran and the Washington Watercolor Society. So keep your eyes open at the local auction houses and estate sales. It would not surprise me to see one of his works pop up. And again, most of them are probably signed.
And he's clearly prolific.
Yeah.
Putting out a lot of work throughout his whole life. So.
And if you find one and you think you found a good one, let us know.
We have a few more quick questions. First, I do want to mention, if you're just now joining us or if you joined us late in the broadcast, please know that this will be on our Facebook page for quite a while, so you can always go back and watch from the beginning. Someone asked, actually, Holmes's great-granddaughter, I believe, Miss Joan Kazar, asked if we have a copy of The Waves During the Crossing to Europe, which I think you might have mentioned earlier.
I think that is the larger painting that we were talking about, and the only reason you're not seeing it today is you have to stop somewhere. And we pulled out, the great thing is that Ed Bray and Denise Wammeling in our print room, and there's Ed, pulled out all of the boxes of Holmes' work and gave us the opportunity to look through them and figure out what we had time to show you today. And so you are literally seeing the tip of the iceberg.
I think we'll take one last question before we wrap up today, and that is, if we have all of the random records, what's the schedule for digitizing the rest?
Oh, great question. Well, it takes a lot to digitize materials here at the Smithsonian. We do it like it's easy, but the care to conserve and digitize these albums, especially with William Henry Holmes, who had a lot of fold-outs, paste-ins, and materials that take extra special care, is pretty time-consuming. And it's also costly to digitize and then host them, but we hope to do them soon because they're full of fantastic materials to look at, and also for researchers in obviously many different disciplines. So we hope soon. Yes.
And I would say that if you have the opportunity to look through any of the digitized volumes, it's a great way to spend a day. It's an adventure as you keep turning the pages. It's really quite wonderful.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you, Eleanor. Thank you, Ed, Denise, and the Smithsonian American Art Museum for opening up your print study room so that we could all take a look at some of the interesting artworks of William Henry Holmes. And you can continue following and catch back up on the blog posts and social media posts you may have missed by looking at #WilliamHenryHolmes. Thanks a bunch.
Bye.